And
Sure. So we're not seeing.
Try with.
Okay.
Yeah, I'm going to try with the video on. It is seemed a bit sketchy, but it's up.
Okay, there you are. We can see it.
Great, thanks everyone. My name is Sarah McPhail, as Karen mentioned. I'm a director in the Financial Sector Policy Unit of National Treasury. I've been with Treasury for over 10 years, but moved back into the Financial Sector Policy Unit in June this year to take forward the recommendations from our paper, which was a draft technical paper, which was released in May. And yeah, thanks to IFC, as Karen mentioned, who've supported us on this journey, and also to BASA as well. So I've got about 7 slides, and apologies for those who have seen these already. I've tried to change them somewhat, but since the paper's been released, I've been encouraged, I guess, by the response and presented the paper at least 20, I would say, events such as a parliamentary working group, represented at BUSA, through NBI. We've done a lot of presentations as well with the regulators, and some with the banks, insurers as well. So starting off with a very kind of broad context on sustainable finance, and I'm taking it as kind of a given that we all agree that climate change is a measurable global reality. The work that was done previously by the International Panel on Climate Change around limiting global warming to 1.5, the Renewable Energy Agency IRENA 2018 report, specifying really that the science is clear. And what we kind of talking about for sustainable finance is how do we deal with global problems that are not limited to individual countries. The global financial crisis in 2008 gave us some indication of this, COVID-19 even more so, and climate change is really now the focus. And we're linking it to the work also around the Sustainable Development Goals and the momentum that's been achieved globally on those. The G20 since 2015 at least has considered the impact of stranded assets as a risk to financial stability. They had a green finance working group, which was renamed and broadened, I guess, to a G20 sustainable finance working group. And particularly over the last 6 to 12 months, increasing demand by investors for companies to disclose their climate risks, as well as their carbon GHG emissions. The London Stock Exchange, the work done by the JSE on this green and bond and sustainable segments, the WEF 2020 economic reports highlighting climate issues as the most likely and pressing, although I guess no one predicted COVID. There is some link between COVID being a zoonotic disease and people encroaching on animals' habitats, as well as the work around the UN's Global Investors for Sustainable Development Alliance. More locally, South Africa is a signatory to the UN Framework for Climate Change Convention. We have voluntarily agreed to the Paris Agreement, and we've submitted initially our nationally determined contributions, which the Department of Environmental Affairs are in the process of revising. We have a national climate change response policy from 2011. We've also, Environmental Affairs have also released an adaptation strategy, a low emissions development strategy, and a climate change bill, which I believe is going through NEDLAC and to Cabinet soon, and recently also approved the establishment of a Presidential Climate Change Coordinating Council. So there's, I think, broad government commitment to addressing climate change and how this evolves over time. South African economy is highly carbon intensive. We have the 13th highest emissions per capita in the world. So when we're looking then specifically at the financial sector, we're talking about physical risks as well as transition risks. These arising from damage to property, infrastructure, and land, and how this manifests through increased default risks of loan portfolios, lower values of assets, increased insurance claims, and risk premiums. Transition risks, particularly when we're talking about a transition to a low carbon economy, and we're also talking about a just transition and a sustainable economy. And these results from change in policies, technologies, and consumer market sentiments during this transition. Locally as well, the National Development Plan, as well as the just transition process that was led by the National Planning Commission, is really saying that climate change is a social justice issue and it's not just an environmental issue. So from a kind of broad global agenda to a South African agenda to now specifically a financial stability mandate, which the Treasury shares with the Reserve Bank to protect our economy from shocks to the financial system and to build resilience through solvency and effective risk management. I think resilience is really a buzzword at the moment, and thankfully it's been part of our financial stability mandate for many, many years. And this is really saying, well, climate risk is a financial risk, and for financial institutions requires identifying, managing, and disclosing both environmental as well as social risks given our country's socio-economic development needs in their portfolio through strengthening regulatory frameworks and the uptake of best practices. This process started with a roundtable in 2016. A working group was formed in 2017. A lot of the work was done in 2017, and initially the paper was to be released early 2018. However, at the same time, we embarked on financial regulatory reform, which resulted in the formation of our Twin Peaks regulation, being the Prudential Authority at the SARB and the Market Conduct Authority, the Financial Sector Conduct Authority. So the paper did get somewhat delayed while the regulatory mechanisms were being finalized. It was revived late in 2019, and Karen did a lot of work on the paper, and it was published this year in May. We've said it was a draft paper, and we've received comments on it. So the working group initially that was involved in the roundtable and the drafting, compiling of the paper included the Reserve Bank, the two financial authorities, the department, the Insurance Association, Banking Association, Savings and Investments, the JSE, as well as BATSETA. Since the release of the paper, we've also roped in our local DFIs, Land Bank and DBSA and IDC, the Department of Monitoring and Evaluation, DPME, SAICA, SAVCA, or is it just the Venture Capital Association, as well as the Principles for Responsible Investing. And there are a few also others that I might have missed out. But regardless, to say it's been a really kind of inclusive approach to developing the paper and now to take forward the recommendations. So the technical paper itself is very broad and holistic in its approach, and it includes recommendations on sustainable finance initiatives to be undertaken by what we're saying is the whole financial services industry. Many other countries have only focused on banks or insurers, but we're saying the paper has covered all sectors. The objectives is to define sustainable finance, and we focused really on climate change mitigation as the starting point for all parts of the South African financial sector, take stock of what's going on globally and nationally to identify market barriers and gaps in regulatory frameworks, and recommend actions required. And it's really to also provide clarity and certainty to the markets around the work that we're doing and we're thinking of and working together on, and also to mobilize the sector to work with us. As I said, the paper was released, the comments have been received, and the comments should hopefully be published before the end of this financial year, and the updated paper early in 2021. Through the Banking Association, we've established a climate risk steering committee, acknowledging that the first step in sustainable finance is really around climate risks, and we've established 5 working groups. A website that was set up in association and through BATSETA has been updated. It's sustainablefinanceinitiative.org.za, and we're updating that website with documents as they're being produced and the work of the working groups itself. So sustainable finance definition. So the international capital markets introduced what I think is a really great graphic on the right-hand side, either just before or just after we published the paper, so it wasn't in it. But the definition that we've got in the paper is that sustainable finance encompasses financial models, products, markets, and ethical practices to deliver resilience and long-term value, in each of the economic, environmental, and social aspects, contributing to the delivery of the SDGs and climate resilience. And financial stability was one of the comments that we need to add financial stability on that. How this is achieved is when the financial sector evaluates portfolio and transaction level environmental and social risk exposures and opportunities using science-based methodologies, best practice norms, discloses and mitigates these risks and links these to products, activities, and capital allocations. It really is an evolving area, an emerging global practice and trend. And we're starting with climate risk. Essentially, the scope includes climate change, mitigation, adaptation, which is what is really called climate finance. And then if you include broader environmental objectives, it's green finance. If you include social issues, governance, impact investment, and look at a broader macroeconomic and financial stability, then you call it sustainable finance. And obviously from a Treasury perspective, economic and financial stability is our core mandate. So, but understanding that, you know, we can't tackle everything at once, what we've focused on specifically for the financial sector is really around climate risk and climate finance, green finance more broadly, and evolving from that. And part of that is we need to understand and quantify the climate risks to determine what the supervisory response should be, to build capacity and to improve data collection. We also see it as so the paper encourages a voluntary approach to sustainable finance initiatives. And part of this is because we see it as a system change rather than a kind of tick box or regulatory reactive exercise. It's not a command and control approach. And we really only want to regulate what is a market failure. And we want to work with the sector, and the sector in some ways is already on this path. So only if we see a market failure, then regulations can be considered and mandated. So the paper goes into each sector, their challenges, the legislation, the global and local context, as well as then specific sector recommendations. I've just highlighted 2 or 3 on this slide around understanding that there are extensive sustainable banking initiatives currently in place, but these are not supervised, and therefore we're unable to draw economy-wide conclusions on the exposure to climate change and other risks from published information. And there's the recommendations is really around the further analysis of feasible regulatory instruments. Insurance survey, which Ash will speak to in more details, around people understanding that climate change will affect their business, but not necessarily reporting on it, and needing to develop the tools and instruments that can assist with this. Retirement funds and asset managers, also to develop and disclose their risk management policy framework, specifically around environmental and social risks and governance systems, in line with the guidance note which FSCA published. So 4 key overarching recommendations for the project, which are now in specific working groups to take these recommendations forward. The first is to develop a taxonomy for green, social, and sustainable investments. I'm chairing this taxonomy and this working group, and we're starting with the development of a green taxonomy. A taxonomy is really a financial classification to provide a common language and to give a coordinated and consistent approach to determine eligibility. We're using the EU Sustainable Finance Taxonomy to align internationally, but to also include South Africa's local context and what transitional activities we can include, and specifically encourage social disclosures. The TCFD Disclosures Working Group, which is being chaired by Karen, is looking at what the principles for disclosure are, understanding some banks have already produced TCFD reports, whether they're separate or part of their integrated reports, and to develop a common sector-wide principles what the technical requirements, specifically data requirements are, and what possible regulatory mechanisms there are. And these could be around supervisory activities or listing requirements or linking to Basel requirements or generally just public integrated reporting. We have a working group to develop a benchmark scenario for use in stress tests. This is limited to the regulators and Treasury at the moment, and they're exploring the different weather scenarios as well as the economic models that can translate those to financial models as well. They're starting with insurance and banks, and I'm sure Ash will speak to SAR being a member of the Network for Greening the Financial Sector, I mean. The fourth working group, which is being chaired by SAICA, is really around building sector capacity and competency. And this is really critical. You know, we can't regulate or expect the sector or local government or the public sector more broadly to respond to risks if we don't have the capacity and competencies to do so. A needs survey has been undertaken in the financial sector, looking at what training needs are required. This is obviously a general raising of awareness event. We have one with the regulators on Monday. We've had, and I've been involved in a few with SAICA and other industry associations as well. And then as we develop to kind of go into more focused areas on the green taxonomy, we've had 6 broad stakeholder sessions as well, which we looked at the private sector, the public sector, the financial sector, companies, renewable energy sector, and whatnot. So the sector capacity and competencies is really starting, obviously, with the financial sector and the regulators. They're also looking at developing specific capacity and competencies and requirements around TCFD reporting. My last slide, there's a 5th working group, which the JSE is chairing. That is around sustainable finance and taking a much kind of broader, holistic look at what instruments there are and their applicability to South Africa. So these working groups really are industry specialists. Many of you are on them, and we're really grateful for everyone who's participating, because it's looking at technical aspects. And this is ultimately to develop a common assessment and a common purpose. We are incorporating broader stakeholder consultations as drafts are developed, because the impact is not only on the financial sector, but much more broadly. The regulators, the recommendation is for the regulators to engage further with the sector and undertake analysis on what are feasible regulatory instruments and where they may or may not be required, and to finalize an action plan coming from the paper. And we're doing that together with the working groups at the moment. The paper is really a first stab at it. We just see it as a manageable starting point to mobilize the financial sector, to move towards more responsible practices to ensure a stable, resilient and competitive economy. And I must say I've been really encouraged by the sector mobilization, during lockdown and COVID, on top of everything else that we're doing, to get these working groups established and really contributing to some important work that's coming out. It really is a kind of a complementary role between government as well as the financial sector, I think, in responding to climate change. So we're building on the sustainable finance narrative that already exists in South Africa and the networks of cooperation and coordination. Ultimately, it's not a silver bullet, and it requires an integrated response. Treasury has a broader agenda around carbon pricing, for example, around climate budget tagging that we're piloting in our budget process, around mainstreaming climate resilience into metros, built environment performance plans. So it really is one piece of a broader puzzle, both in terms of Treasury as a system, government as a system, and the financial sector and economy more broadly. It's really important for us that we incorporate transitional activities and social safeguards. And this is around how you mainstream the green agenda into our economic agenda and our economic growth plans. The green economy is not a separate economy to our normal economy. And Treasury's kind of economic growth strategy talks to network industries, which is transport, energy, water, telecommunications, and the structural and policy requirements in those sectors. So part of this kind of agenda around building back better is already within our economic growth strategy, our employment stimulus response, and things like that. Obviously, we have huge fiscal constraints. I'm not going to go into those here, but we really also see it as not only addressing risks, but creating investment opportunities, primarily for local, but as well as international finance, into what we're saying is a green, low carbon, sustainable economy. I think that's it from me. I'm just checking my notes if I've forgotten anything.
Thank you so much, Sarah.
Pleasure.
We have a chat line, so if people want to address questions to Sarah for the discussion session, please put them into the chat line. But thank you so much, Sarah. That's a whirlwind overview. And I think for the audience,